The wind moves first, a sigh that carries the scent of cedar and distant snow. Then, through the thinning veil of night, a figure appears, barefoot upon frost, wrapped in the color of twilight. He walks as though the world itself is an echo beneath his steps, each footprint a brief prayer pressed into the skin of the earth. No banner follows him, no temple guards his memory. Only the hush of the valley keeps him company, and the first faint bell of morning, trembling through the cold. They once called him by a name now swallowed by centuries. Some said he was a philosopher who turned away from courts and kings. Others whispered he was a monk who refused silence until it became his only truth. In the oldest monasteries, fragments of his words remain, carved in crumbling plaster, inked between the lines of other men's scriptures. Seek not the light, one line reads, but the space that allows it to appear. He left the great library at Antioch in the last years before the fires. They say he burned his own scrolls before departing, that he wished no disciples to follow. He spoke once, it is told, of a place where dawn rises not from the east, but from within, a horizon carried inside the chest. Perhaps it was this inner dawn that called him beyond the mountains, past the lamps of civilization into the pale silence where sky and stone become the same color. The valley stretches like an open scroll, blank and endless. Here the wind remembers more than men do. A traveler centuries later found fragments of clay, marked with symbols like stars and spirals, the kind used by early mystics to record breath patterns rather than words. Some believe these were his lessons, not written in ink, but exhaled in rhythm with the earth itself. He moved westward, following rivers that no longer flow, mountains now buried under the shifting crust of ages. At night, he would light a single oil lamp and draw circles in the sand around it. When the flame flickered, he whispered, not prayers, but questions. Why does truth vanish when spoken aloud? Why does the seeker disappear when the search ends? The wind answered in its own tongue, scattering dust like faded letters across the plain. In the ruins of an old temple near Haran, archaeologists uncovered a wall etched with the outline of a human hand. Around it were faint inscriptions, neither Greek nor Aramaic, but something older, fluid like water. A scholar once claimed it was the mark of this lost teacher, his final gesture carved before vanishing into the wilderness. The hand, raised but not in blessing, seems poised between offering and surrender, as if caught in the act of saying goodbye to certainty. By twilight, the sky turns the color of ash and pearl. The teacher stands upon a ridge where no path continues. Below him, a river winds through the dark, the river that remembers, the locals called it, though its name in their tongue meant something closer to the water that dreams of the sea. He kneels beside it and watches the current mirror the clouds. Perhaps he sees his reflection there, or perhaps only the shape of every life he's ever touched without being known. There is a legend still told among desert monks, that on certain mornings, when the light first touches the mountains, a shadow can be seen crossing the valley, a long, patient stride fading toward the horizon. They call it the hour of the lost teacher, and in that moment, bells are rung softly, as if not to disturb his journey. His teachings, if they were ever meant to endure, have survived only in fragments. The rhythm of footsteps, the whisper of wind in the cedars, the silence that lingers after a question too vast to answer. The truth he sought may have been less a discovery than a dissolving, a slow unbinding of all that binds. Years later, a caravan passing through that valley found only ruins, outlines of hearths, fragments of pottery marked with spirals, and silence so dense it seemed alive. No one could say what became of the people. Perhaps they moved deeper into the mountains. Perhaps they dissolved into legend. But sometimes, at dusk, when the wind moves through olive branches, it shapes itself into faint syllables, a language without sound, as if the earth itself still remembers the gestures of those who chose to be forgotten. The teacher would speak of them no more in his remaining journeys. Yet every time he raised his hand in reflection, his fingers formed the same shape the elder woman had drawn in the dust, a widening circle that vanished into air. It was his way of remembering the ones who taught him to forget. And as the years folded into one another, their lesson deepened. that memory is a gentle illusion, and forgetting is sometimes the holiest act. The world has many names for wisdom, but perhaps the purest of them is silence. So when you close your eyes tonight and the noise of the day begins to fade, listen carefully between your own thoughts. Somewhere, beyond the veil of speech, that nameless village still exists. Hearths glowing, hands moving, eyes meeting in quiet understanding. A place that cannot be mapped, only felt in the soft echo between heartbeats. The wind had changed by the time he reached the plateau, a vast emptiness where only dust and light conversed. The horizon shimmered like glass, and through it rose the ruins of an ancient library, its arches fractured but still reaching for the sky. The locals called it the House of Breath, for when wind passed through its hollow corridors, it produced a low, resonant hum, as if the walls themselves remembered the rhythm of reading. He stepped through the broken gate. Fragments of inscription still clung to the stones. Half-letters, faint spirals, a trace of language older than ink. He moved slowly, for even silence seemed sacred here. The air carried the scent of age. Limestone dust, burnt resin, and something faintly sweet, the ghost of cedar shelves long turned to powder. And in the center of the ruin lay a single scroll, rolled and tied with a strip of linen, untouched by time. He knelt, brushing away a layer of sand. The linen disintegrated beneath his fingers, and the scroll unfurled itself like a breath released after centuries of waiting. But there was nothing on it. No words, no ink, only the faint shimmer of fibers catching the light. The blankness was so complete it felt deliberate, as if the absence itself were the message. For a moment, he wondered if it was an unfinished work. Yet when he turned it toward the sun, faint impressions appeared, not letters, but traces of handwriting erased with care. Someone had written, then withdrawn the thought, leaving behind the ghost of intention. He understood then. This was not the work of a careless scribe, but of someone who wished knowledge to vanish softly, leaving only its shadow. Legends spoke of scholars who once gathered here to copy the wisdom of empires. Sumerian hymns, Babylonian mathematics, Alexandrian treatises smuggled across deserts. When war came, they buried the scrolls beneath the floor, believing truth could survive if hidden. Centuries later, wanderers dug them out, only to find them blank. Perhaps the ink had faded, or perhaps the words had been taken back by the same silence that gave them birth. Some say he reached a monastery beyond the known world, where snow never melts and dawn burns blue through the mist. Others believe he became one with the path itself, that he walks still, invisible to those who hurry but near to those who rest. He sat where the light pooled through the cracked dome, holding the scroll on his knees. The dust moved in slow spirals around him, stirred by invisible drafts. It looked like smoke or breath, as if the room were exhaling. He traced a line across the parchment, not to write, but to feel its texture, its softness, its still warmth from the sun. The dust clung to his fingertip and formed a thin trail, a mark that vanished as soon as he moved. It was like being allowed to write upon the wind. He remembered the village that had forgotten its name, the gestures that replaced words, the silence that taught better than any sermon. Perhaps the scroll was the same teaching, a reminder that truth, when bound to language, begins to die. To preserve it, one must erase it gently, returning it to the breath from which it came. As the day deepened, he wandered through the other chambers. In one, he found the outline of a table etched into stone, surrounded by hollow sockets where lamps once stood. In another, walls covered in soot from ancient fires. On the far side of the ruin, he found a single door still intact, carved with the image of an open eye within a circle. Beneath it, a line faintly legible. To see is to unsee. He sat before the door until twilight bled into violet, thinking of all the seekers before him, the ones who wrote, then withdrew, the ones who carved, then let sand erase their work. Maybe their wisdom wasn't lost. Maybe it had simply reached a gentler form, one beyond the hunger of preservation. When the wind rose, he gathered a handful of dust and scattered it over the scroll. The grains settled like a veil. In that moment, faint marks appeared again, lines, curves, shapes like constellations. He leaned close and saw that it wasn't writing at all, but a pattern resembling the night sky. Orion bending, the Pleiades clustered, the faint arc of the Milky Way. The scroll was not a text. It was a map of silence, a record of where words once shone before being swallowed by eternity. He placed it back upon the stone slab and bowed, not as a scholar before a relic, but as a listener before a voice too subtle to hear. The hum of the wind grew deeper, filling the space like the low tone of a hidden bell. It seemed to say, "Everything you name returns to dust, but dust remembers in its own way." He left the ruin just as the first stars appeared, the horizon fading to indigo. Behind him, the library glowed faintly in the dusk, not from fire or moonlight, but from its own slow remembering. He looked back once, and it seemed the building inhaled, as though drawing in all the words ever spoken, turning them again to air. When he reached the edge of the plateau, he turned his empty hands upward. The night wind ran through his fingers, warm as breath. Somewhere behind him, the scroll lay open beneath the rising stars, blank yet infinite. A silent scripture written not to be read, but to be felt. Perhaps that is how all wisdom survives. Not in parchment or ink, but in the space where both disappear. For some truths cannot be recorded. They must be erased into remembrance, written softly in dust, carried by the wind that never forgets. The final image remains. A hand lifted against the rising sun, not commanding, not blessing, but releasing. As if to say, everything you seek must one day be allowed to go. The wind folds around him, the lamp fades, and the valley swallows the echo of his steps. He arrived just before nightfall, at the hour when the horizon still holds a faint breath of light, but the heavens have already begun to gather their lamps. Before him rose a shape half swallowed by sand. Not a mountain, not a ruin, but something between both. Its walls leaned as though listening. Its stones were fused with time. Yet even in decay, the geometry was perfect. 4 pillars aligned with the north, the east, the south, and the west. The people of the valley called it the temple that faced the stars. Wind passed through its corridors with the tone of distant chanting. The roof had fallen, leaving only the sky as its ceiling, so that every constellation looked down upon the altar, a meeting of heaven and stone. He stepped forward carefully, each footfall raising a whisper of dust that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The air smelled of salt and old incense, and somewhere in the darkness, water dripped with the patience of centuries. It is said that the first astronomer priests built it when the world was young. They carved the ceiling to mirror the constellations of their age, Orion standing tall above the southern arch, the Pleiades traced above the northern gate, the slow curve of the Milky Way winding between. When the roof fell, the sky took its place exactly, as if the builders had always intended that collapse. A temple meant to fall open, that its prayer could reach beyond itself. The teacher entered with his lamp cupped in his hand. Its small flame flickered against stone figures long eroded, faces without features, robes reduced to folds of shadow. Yet one statue still stood intact, a figure pointing not upward, but inward, toward its own heart. Beneath it, a single line of inscription, almost gone. "The sky is not above you. It is within you." He lingered before it for a long time, then looked up. Through the open roof, the stars shone with the clarity of new creation. He realized the temple's floor formed a vast compass, its lines converging toward a single circular depression, perhaps once filled with oil or water to reflect the heavens. Now it was dry, but he knelt beside it and ran his fingers along the grooves. Dust sparkled like constellations reborn in miniature. He thought of how ancient peoples had measured time not by clocks but by the slow procession of stars, the rising of Sirius, the turning of Polaris, the brief season when Venus burned blue instead of gold. He remembered how, in the lost scrolls of Alexandria, astronomers were also mystics, seekers who believed that by mapping the heavens they mapped the soul. Perhaps this temple had been their observatory, their sanctuary of correspondence between the outer and the inner sky. A faint wind stirred. The lamp's flame bent sideways, and on the far wall he saw shadows shift. a cluster of points shimmering faintly, like reflections cast by unseen glass. He rose and followed them to the altar. There, embedded in the stone, were fragments of crystal, once lenses, now cracked but still clear enough to catch starlight. When the breeze passed, the crystals refracted the glow into patterns across the walls, a map of moving light. It was as if the stars themselves had descended to write their own scripture. He whispered a verse once attributed to an ancient teacher of the East. The universe sleeps in stone, dreams in plant, awakens in man. Here, he thought, perhaps the universe had opened its eyes. The stones were awake, watching, and perhaps it was never meant to be found, the truth he carried beyond the dawn. He set his lamp in the center of the compass and let its glow join the light of the stars. Then he lay back upon the floor, staring upward. The constellations slowly turned, aligning with the carvings around him. For a moment, a breath, perhaps less, heaven and earth became one pattern, a single symmetrical design pulsing with quiet recognition. In that union, he felt something both vast and tender, that the stars did not watch us from above. They moved through us, and we through them, like breath through a flute. He understood then why the builders had faced the temple toward the sky, not to worship, but to remember. The heavens were not remote. They were the first scripture, the one no fire could destroy, the one every soul was born knowing how to read. The constellations were not destinies but reminders, that all journeys, no matter how far, trace the same invisible circle home. He closed his eyes. The hum of the wind deepened. Dust drifted like slow snow. He could almost hear voices, not words, but tones, rising and falling in rhythm with his breathing. Perhaps the old priests were still here, their prayers carved into the air itself. Or perhaps it was the mountain remembering the language of devotion. When he rose to leave, he turned once more toward the statue pointing to its heart. He placed his palm over his own chest and bowed. Above him, the night was perfectly clear. The stars seemed closer now, not cold or distant, but companioned, familiar, almost human. He walked out as dawn approached, the eastern horizon pale and trembling. Behind him, the temple shimmered faintly in the half-light, as if made of breath instead of stone. For a moment, it seemed to tilt toward the rising sun, not to worship it, but to whisper, "I have seen your reflection. I know you." And when the first light spilled through the broken roof, it touched the crystal fragments on the altar, scattering a brief storm of color across the walls, violet, gold, and silver, as though the stars themselves were blessing the ruins they had once inspired. He did not look back again. Some truths, once seen, cannot be faced twice without breaking the heart. The wind followed him down the slope, carrying the last of the temple's hum, a sound like breath through hollow stone, a memory of the universe remembering itself. Perhaps, he thought, all temples are merely mirrors waiting to return the sky. He descended from the mountains into a valley that seemed untouched by clocks. The air there moved slower, and even light seemed reluctant to leave. Between two ridges, a grove of cypress trees formed a perfect circle around a pool no wider than a small courtyard. The locals, when they spoke of it at all, called it the Garden of Still Time, a place where the seasons forgot to turn, and days lost the desire to end. He arrived in the hush before dawn. Mist rose from the pool like breath from a sleeping god. Each blade of grass carried dew that refused to fall, as though caught forever in the first instant of morning. The teacher stood at the edge of the circle and waited. There was no wind, no birdsong, only the sound of his own heartbeat echoing softly inside him. It was as if the world were holding its breath, only remembered in breath, in quiet, in the space where sound once was. Stories whispered by desert travelers said that this garden had once belonged to an order of monks who devoted their lives to stopping time. Not by magic, but by perfect stillness. They believed that time was a wound in the universe, caused by movement and desire, and that by ceasing to strive, one could make the wound close. Their last abbot, legend claimed, vanished one night in mid-breath, leaving only a ring of undisturbed dust where he had been sitting. The teacher found traces of their presence. Smooth stones arranged in spirals, bowls carved from single pieces of alabaster, and faint markings on the bark of the cypress. Not words, but tally-like strokes counting something unseen. Perhaps hours, perhaps moments, perhaps the number of times they had remembered to forget. He removed his sandals and stepped into the garden. The earth was cool beneath his feet, soft as fabric. At the center stood an old bench carved from a fallen trunk. He sat, and in that instant, even his breath seemed to slow to match the rhythm around him. The pool before him mirrored not the sky but a pale, suspended moon, though dawn was already brightening the horizon. Somehow the reflection did not obey the hour. It was as if the moon had chosen to remain. He thought of how men measure everything, the days between harvests, the length of a rain, the rise and fall of shadows on a wall. But here the only measurement was stillness itself. The reeds at the water's edge did not move. A single droplet hung from one leaf, trembling but never falling. And as he gazed, he began to understand. Perhaps time was not a river, as philosophers claimed, but a lake, disturbed only when we struggle against it. He remembered the temple that faced the stars, the silent scroll, the nameless village. Each had taught him the same truth in a different way, that motion blinds the eye to what remains. So he let himself grow still, slowly erasing the line between his body and the garden's calm. Thoughts came and went like faint birds over distant dunes. He did not follow them. He let them vanish into the horizon of his mind. A strange thing happened then. The sounds of the world began to return, the hum of an insect, the sigh of a reed bending under its own weight. Yet they did not feel separate from silence. It was as if silence itself had decided to speak. And in its voice, he heard something tender, almost childlike. The remembrance of everything that ever was, without the pain of wanting it back. He closed his eyes and felt the shape of the earth beneath him. The rhythm of his heart merged with something slower, deeper, the pulse of the soil, the slow exhalation of leaves. For a moment, he could not tell if he was breathing or being breathed. He understood then that time was not a tyrant but a companion who waited patiently for us to listen. As afternoon drifted near, a subtle shimmer crossed the pool. The reflection of the moon faded, replaced by the faint outline of a face. Not his, but another's, serene and luminous. It looked upon him without expression, and he realized it was not a vision but a memory of the monks who had once sat here, still enough to be remembered by the water. He bowed his head and whispered the only prayer that felt true, gratitude for the silence that keeps the world alive. When he finally rose, the droplet fell from the reed and vanished into the pool with the gentlest of sounds. The air stirred, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and cedar. Time began to move again, softly, reluctantly, like a child waking from sleep. He stepped backward out of the circle, careful not to disturb its fragile harmony. Behind him, the garden remained unchanged, untouched by his passing. It would wait for the next traveler who had lost the need to hurry. Some places, he thought, are not meant to be visited but remembered, and some moments not meant to be counted but lived once and never again. For some voices only echo when the world is ready to listen. As he walked toward the fading horizon, the teacher glanced back one final time. The mist had returned, curling upward like incense, erasing every trace of his footprints. Only the stillness remained, that ancient, breathing silence where even time itself bowed its head. Perhaps eternity is not endless duration, he thought, but the brief instant when we stop trying to measure it. And the garden, forever waiting between heartbeats, whispered back. Yes. He found it at twilight, when the light loses its certainty, half gold, half ash. The land fell away before him into a narrow ravine filled with mist, and from one side stretched a bridge of stone, or what remained of it. It reached out halfway across the chasm and then stopped, as though whoever built it had lost faith in distance. The edges of the last stone were broken cleanly, like a thought interrupted mid-sentence. He stood before it, the wind tugging at his robe, the sound of unseen water far below. The bridge looked ancient but unfinished. Moss clung to its surface, and small flowers had rooted in the cracks. Each stone bore faint carvings, spirals, suns, lines that hinted at measurements but refused to explain themselves. He ran his hand over them and felt that familiar hum of intention, the quiet of something begun in hope and left to dream in silence. The villagers in the valley had told him of it, always with a strange tenderness. They said their ancestors built it not to cross, but to remember that crossing was impossible. Every generation added a stone and then stopped at the same point, honoring those who never reached the other side. It keeps us humble, an old man had said. It reminds us that not all paths are meant to meet. As night thickened, he lit his small bronze lamp and walked to the edge. The bridge ended in air. Below, the ravine breathed mist upward like smoke from a censer. The wind carried a deep sound, perhaps water, perhaps memory. He sat near the edge and listened. He thought of all the bridges humankind had built, across rivers, across divisions, across time itself. They always reached, always connected, always promised return. But this one, this bridge that led nowhere, felt more truthful. It did not claim completion. It spoke in its own quiet grammar of humility. In its incompleteness, it mirrored the soul itself, forever building toward something unseen. He traced the carvings again, noticing one symbol repeated between stones, a circle split by a single line. A scholar might call it the mark of an ancient builder's guild. But to him it looked like the horizon, the meeting place between heaven and earth, the seen and unseen. Perhaps that was what the bridge was reaching for all along. Not the opposite shore, but the line where everything ends and begins at once. At the edge of the known world, where dawn climbs slowly over ancient ridges, there stands a mountain that once was said to breathe. Its face is pale with old snow, veined with the gray of forgotten ages. No road leads there now, only the ghosts of paths worn by sand and wind. Travelers speak of it in half-whispers, as if the name itself might awaken something asleep beneath its stones. The moon rose and cast a pale path over the stone. The mist below glowed faintly, like milk poured into shadow. He could see the other cliff now, close enough that his breath could almost touch it, yet separated by a space too wide for any leap. It looked calm, unreachable, complete. He smiled, thinking how every seeker lives upon such a half-built bridge. One foot in knowing, one in wonder, forever balanced above the unknown. The night grew colder. He placed his lamp on the final stone and watched the flame bend in the wind. It flickered as if it, too, hesitated before the void. He whispered to it, "You need not cross. You need only shine." The flame steadied. It cast light into the mist, revealing nothing and everything. Somewhere in the distance, a single bell rang. The sound floated across the ravine, clear, unhurried, unclaiming. He imagined the builders who once stood where he now sat, their hands dusty, their hearts uncertain, their work halted by doubt or death or divine instruction. Yet still, the bridge remained, bearing witness to their unfinished devotion. He felt an ache, not of sorrow, but of recognition. To begin and never finish, that is the human condition. In time, the wind softened, and the mist rose higher, wrapping the bridge in its folds. The lamplight turned the fog into gold. He could no longer tell where stone ended and air began. He reached his hand forward and found only space, vast and yielding, felt alive like breath. He whispered into it, "Perhaps the other side was never meant to be reached. Perhaps the crossing is here, in the waiting." The echo of his voice returned faintly, not from ahead but from within, as though the bridge itself had spoken back. He closed his eyes and listened to that echo fade into nothingness. And in that nothingness he found peace. When dawn came, he rose and turned away. Behind him, the lamp still burned faintly, though the oil should have been gone hours ago. The light hovered at the edge of the last stone, patient and unafraid. As he walked down the path, he did not look back. Some bridges are not to be crossed, only honored. Later travelers would say that on misty mornings, a figure could be seen standing at the end of the bridge, motionless, facing the void, a silhouette caught between departure and return. They never approached, for to do so would break the stillness that held the place together. The teacher carried that image with him long after. The unfinished bridge, the unwavering lamp, the void that received both without judgment. It became his quiet creed, that perfection lies not in completion, but in the courage to stop where mystery begins. And so, when the wind whispers through chasms at dusk, it sometimes carries the sound of stone breathing, a reminder that even what leads nowhere can still lead us inward. It was here, they say, that the wandering teacher came after many months of silence. He carried no staff, no scrolls, only a lamp of beaten bronze and the weight of unspoken thought. The valley below lay hushed in mist, and as he climbed, each breath rose like incense into the thinning air. By the time he reached the summit, the world had fallen away behind him. Cities, disciples, even memory. What remained was sky, endless, unbroken, and the mountain listening. For the soul, too, must one day learn to stand at the edge and simply listen. The teacher came to the desert when the season of dust began, that time each year when the horizon disappears and the world becomes a single color of forgetting. For days he walked beneath a white sun that gave no warmth, across plains where even the wind had forgotten direction. He was following a story, or perhaps it was following him. A tale told by caravanners around dying fires, of a city buried so deep that only its echo remained. They called it Ashara, the city that listened. Long ago, it was said, its people built their homes from limestone that rang when struck. So every hammer, every footstep, every voice became part of a great vibration that never faded. When the city fell to drought and war, the desert took it, grain by grain, until nothing was left above ground. But travelers still swore they could hear faint music beneath the dunes, as though the stones were still remembering the sound of life. At the edge of a dry wadi he found the place. The sand there formed a hollow unlike the others, smooth as the inside of a bowl. Beneath it the wind made no sound. When he stepped into that silence, the earth seemed to yield, as though something vast and sleeping stirred just below. He knelt and pressed his ear to the sand. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, a vibration. The pulse of air moving through hidden chambers, the tremor of an old rhythm still alive. It reminded him of the hum of the mountain, of the voice that never died. The desert was not empty. It was full of memory waiting to be touched. He began to dig. The sand slid away easily, as if eager to reveal what it had protected. Beneath a shallow layer he uncovered the top of a column, carved with spirals and marks of the sun, the moon, and something between them. A symbol of balance, perhaps, or the moment before dawn. The stone was smooth, but warm, as if it still held the breath of its makers. He traced the pattern with his fingers and felt the faintest hum, the same low tone he had heard through the ground. He followed it. Each step revealed more, the curve of an arch, the rim of a fountain, the broken lid of a jar turned to dust inside. As he moved, the hum grew deeper, more resonant, until it seemed to rise from the air itself. The sound was not random. It carried cadence, intervals like chanting. It was the voice of the city itself, still singing long after the singers were gone. He stood in awe. The sky above was colorless, and yet he felt surrounded by light. Not the sun's harsh glare, but something softer, diffused through centuries of silence. He understood then why this city was said to have been founded by priests of sound. Mystics who believed that creation began not with sight or fire, but with vibration. They had tuned their temples to the harmonics of the wind, shaping architecture into instrument, faith into frequency. He closed his eyes and listened fully. The tones shifted, revealing undertones like deep breathing. In them, he thought he could almost discern syllables, as if the earth were speaking in a language older than form. For a moment, it felt like a memory awakening inside him. Not of this life, but of some shared ancestry of spirit. He realized that perhaps the teacher he sought was never a man at all, but this sound, the unending voice beneath all things. When he opened his eyes, the sun had fallen lower, and the wind had begun to rise again. The sand lifted, curling in thin veils that caught the light like gold dust. Slowly, the shapes he had uncovered began to vanish once more. The city closed itself gently, as if returning to sleep. He did not resist. He stepped back and let the dunes reclaim the stones, one breath at a time. Scholars later argued whether this mountain was real. Some claim it was Mount Nemrut, crowned with the stone heads of forgotten gods. Others believe it to be one of the Armenian peaks near Lake Van, where ancient astronomer priests once charted the songs of the stars. Yet those who walked near its shadow swear that when the wind shifted, the rock itself would hum, deep and low, like the voice of the earth remembering its first prayer. By the time twilight came, there was no sign he had ever been there, only the endless plain, the quiet wind, the hum beneath his feet. He set his lamp on the sand and watched the flame dance without sound. He thought of all the cities mankind had built, of marble, of metal, of words, and how time swallowed them each in turn. Yet this buried city still spoke, not in ruins, but in resonance. It had transcended decay by becoming pure vibration, an invisible temple underfoot, built not for sight, but for listening. He understood then that what is buried is not always lost. Some truths sink because the surface cannot hold them. The desert, like silence, is not absence. It is preservation in another form. When he left, he did not look back. There was nothing to see. But as he walked, the hum followed him. A tone so low it lived between heartbeat and breath. It seemed to pulse from the soles of his feet through his bones, until he could no longer tell whether it came from the earth or from within. Later that night, when the stars rose and the sand cooled, he rested beside his lamp. The desert stretched around him, wide as thought. He whispered a final question into the darkness. If everything is one great song, who listens when it ends? The wind did not answer. It only carried his words back in fragments, softened into rhythm, folded into the hum. And as he drifted toward sleep, he felt that hum become his own pulse. The buried city breathing through him, the silence of the ages speaking once more through dust. Perhaps the city beneath the sand was never meant to be found. Perhaps it only waits for those who have learned to listen deeply enough to hear the world remember itself. The story of that night survives in fragments. Half a verse carved into a temple wall, a line from a forgotten hymn, the memory of a monk who swore he saw 3 small flames moving against the wind where no man stood. They call it the Night of the 3 Lamps, and it begins at the edge of a cold plain beneath a sky of slow-moving clouds. The teacher had walked far by then. His robe was threadbare, the color of dust. His lamp, dented and blackened by years of journey. He carried no possessions, only oil enough for a single night. Yet something in him whispered to stop, here, in this emptiness between mountain and sea, as though the earth itself were holding its breath, waiting. He gathered 3 stones and placed them in a line upon the ground. Upon each he set a lamp, one from the east, one from the north, one from his own pack. With trembling hands, he poured a little oil into each bowl. The wind was sharp, but he struck the flame anyway, and to his quiet astonishment, all 3 lamps caught fire at once. The teacher stood before that sound and began to speak. Not loudly, not as one delivering doctrine, but gently, the way one speaks to an old friend after years apart. Each word rolled down the slope like a drop of rain along glass. The mountain answered in echoes, reshaping syllables until meaning dissolved into pure tone. To those who might have listened from afar, it would have seemed he was conversing with the mountain itself, a dialogue between flesh and stone. For a long while he simply watched them. The flames stood still, small and certain. Their light pooled upon the stones like water. The desert around them turned to gold, and the stars seemed to bend nearer, curious. He bowed his head, sensing that this moment, humble and wordless, was the completion of everything he had not been able to say. Legends later claimed that each lamp was meant for a different traveler. The first, it was said, burned for those who search but never find, the seekers who keep the world awake. The second was for those who find but cannot keep, the dreamers who glimpse the truth only long enough to love it. And the third, the teacher's own, was for those who never search at all, yet still arrive, souls who stumble into grace as one might wander into dawn. He did not explain this. He only tended the flames, feeding them drops of oil as the night deepened. Each burned with a slightly different hue, one amber, one pale blue, one almost white. When the wind rose, the three leaned toward each other, their light mingling into a single trembling sphere. He whispered to them as though to children, "Stay until morning." From the dark beyond, a jackal cried, and then all was still again. The teacher sat cross-legged in the sand, eyes half closed, breathing with the flames. The stars moved slowly overhead, the familiar constellations shifting like a slow wheel. He remembered the temple that faced them, the night sky carved in stone. How those ancient builders had sought harmony between heaven and earth, and here it was, reflected in three small lamps flickering in the dust. Hours passed. The air grew colder. Frost began to form on the sand, sparkling under the lamplight. His breath rose in thin plumes that glowed for an instant before fading. He realized he could no longer feel the boundaries of his body, only warmth and rhythm, as if he too were a flame. Each breath matched the pulse of the fire before him. Then something unseen changed. The wind stopped completely. The lamps burned perfectly still, their flames upright and silent. He sensed not absence, but presence, an awareness larger than his own, the quiet arrival of something ancient and kind. He lifted his head, and for the first time in many years, smiled. It was said that from miles away, shepherds saw a faint glow rising from the plain, three lights hovering like stars upon the ground. Some thought they were omens, others the souls of saints. But when morning came and the shepherds reached the place, they found only the stones, each warm to the touch, each bearing a trace of soot in the shape of a circle. The teacher was gone. Some believe he walked into the desert and vanished. Others say he ascended in light, or became the wind that guards the lamps still. But in monasteries across the east, small altars are kept with three lamps always burning, their flames tended in silence. Pilgrims bow before them not to pray, but to remember that every soul carries these three lights, the one that seeks, the one that loses, and the one that simply shines. When the wind passes through such places, it hums faintly, like a long exhale, as though the world itself is remembering that night. It is said the third lamp, the one belonging to the teacher, has never gone out. Some swear they've seen it, burning unseen behind the veil of dawn, hovering just beyond the mountains where the sky begins to glow. He spoke of the burden of knowing, of the hollow that forms when truth is named. He spoke of the first builders who had carved temples toward the sky and of the uncarved silence that still held more wisdom than marble ever could. All form is the forgetting of breath, he said, tracing a spiral in the dust at his feet. The wind caught the circle and carried it outward, scattering it among the cliffs like a blessing set free. And so the story ends in light, soft, steady, unpossessed. Not revelation, but remembrance. A small flame that endures because it has forgotten the need to last. Perhaps the true lesson was never about the lamps themselves, but the silence between them, where light touches light and becomes one, where seeking ends not in finding, but in quiet. For some truths cannot be carried. They can only be tended like fire. And when we are ready, they will burn through our darkness, gently, patiently, without ever asking for a name. The sea was waiting for him. He could feel it long before he saw it, the faint taste of salt on the wind, the rhythm beneath his feet that was not quite heartbeat, not quite tide. After years of mountains, deserts, gardens, and ruins, the teacher followed that pulse to its source. It led him down through barren cliffs the color of ash, through reeds whispering like old prayers, until at last he stood before the shore. A stretch of pale sand curved like a sleeping animal beneath the dawn. The waves came quietly, no thunder, no roar, only the slow inhalation and release of a living world. The horizon was a line so fine it could have been drawn by breath. Beyond it, the sky dissolved into sea without border, as though creation had forgotten to finish the separation between heaven and water. He stood at the edge for a long time, motionless, his robe brushing against the tide. Each wave that touched him retreated as if in recognition, leaving thin veils of foam that curled around his feet before vanishing. It felt like a greeting from something older than memory, a homecoming without address. No one knows if he had been here before, yet everything about this place spoke of beginning. The gulls circled lazily overhead, their cries soft as distant bells. The air smelled of salt and thyme. On the beach lay fragments of ancient shells, smooth as bone, hollow as small temples. He knelt to pick one up and held it to his ear. Inside, the sea spoke in a language he almost understood, a slow rhythm of return and release. They say that the first philosophers once came to the sea to measure the stars, believing that reflection was the key to knowledge. But he came for unlearning. The shore was not a mirror to study, but a threshold to surrender. Every footprint he made was immediately taken back. Every trace of his arrival vanished before he could look behind him. He smiled, there was mercy in that erasure. At night he lit his bronze lamp. Its flame flickered against the frozen air, and the mountain shimmered as if draped in liquid gold. A faint music rose, perhaps from fissures deep below, perhaps from the stars themselves, shimmering on the thin horizon. The teacher listened, and something within him recognized the cadence, the rhythm of existence before words began. He walked along the water's edge until the sun began to rise. The surface shimmered with impossible colors, gold, violet, blue fading to silver. It looked less like light and more like memory itself. He thought of the mountain that had heard his voice, the bridge that led nowhere, the lamps that had burned for seekers and dreamers and those who simply shone. Each place had taken something from him, gently, until now there was nothing left to give. And in that emptiness he felt complete. At a small inlet, he found remnants of an old pier, its wooden posts leaning like tired monks in prayer. Seaweed hung from them like forgotten banners. He sat upon the lowest beam, the waves brushing his sandals. The lamp he had carried all these years rested in his lap, its metal darkened, its oil long gone. He did not light it. The light was already everywhere. The tide was rising. It reached the hem of his robe and climbed higher, soaking the cloth with cold clarity. He did not move. He looked out to where the sea met the sky and whispered a single word. Not a prayer, not a farewell, simply a sound that carried gratitude without language. The wind caught it and carried it away, scattering it over the water like a seed. It is said that the monks who later came to that coast found his footprints leading down into the tide, and then no more. They built a small shrine there, nothing more than a circle of stones and a single shell set in the center. No image, no inscription, just the sound of waves passing through the hollow shell like a breath through bone. They called it the place of listening. Fishermen who passed that way at dusk claimed they sometimes saw a figure standing where the water met the sand, robes flowing with the tide, hand raised not in farewell but in blessing. When they approached, he was gone, leaving only the sea shining strangely calm. Perhaps he did not vanish. Perhaps he simply joined what had always been calling him, the rhythm of return that moves through all things. Every step, every silence, every question had led here, to the place where boundaries dissolve, and the seeker becomes the shore itself. As the tide pulled back that morning, the sea left behind small spirals of foam that shimmered in the light, symbols drawn by water, erased by wind. The monks would later trace them and whisper his teachings, which were not commandments but pauses, to stand, to listen, to disappear. He had crossed every distance, and yet there was no arrival, only the unending motion of being carried. The sea became his last teacher, patient, eternal, unknowable. And in its vast breathing he heard again the hum of the buried city, the whisper of the garden, the sigh of the wind through the mountain, all the voices of the world folding into one. As evening returned, waves lapped against the rocks, each one murmuring his name, not to remember him, but to let it go. The horizon glowed for a moment, then dimmed. The world exhaled. The lamp upon the shore flickered once, and went out. Perhaps he was never meant to reach the other side. Perhaps the journey was only ever meant to bring him here, to this quiet line where all things meet and rest. Legends tell that he remained there for 40 days. Pilgrims later claimed to find the faint outline of his resting place, a small hollow lined with cedar branches turned to stone. In its center, A single pebble was marked with a pattern resembling a human ear. Some said the mountain had listened so deeply that it began to remember the shape of listening. And perhaps the sea, forever speaking in sleep, still carries his voice, rising and falling with every tide, teaching without words the final lesson, that all paths end not in silence, but in listening. When the teacher finally descended, the air carried a strange stillness with it. Birds flew lower, and even streams seemed to murmur more softly. Villagers miles away spoke of dreams in which they heard a single tone, neither sorrowful nor joyful, but vast, a sound that felt like forgiveness. In the monasteries that later rose along these ranges, chants began with one drawn-out note held until breath surrendered, a tribute to the voice once absorbed by stone. No record says what the teacher found in that communion. Some believe he realized that truth does not speak back, it listens. Others think he learned that every echo is a form of prayer returning home. Whatever revelation touched him, it could not be written. It could only be carried, quietly, within his step. As the sun bled into evening, he turned once more to the mountain. The lamp flame fluttered, caught by the wind. He raised his hand, the same gesture seen carved centuries later on distant walls. Neither farewell nor command, but acknowledgement. One consciousness greeting another. Then he walked away, leaving the lamp upon a ledge where it burned long into night, its glow mirrored in the snow like a second moon. When storms roll across that range today, travelers say the thunder sounds different there. Lower, slower, as though remembering a man who once spoke to the stones. Some nights, if you press your ear to the ground, you may feel a pulse, gentle and steady, deep beneath the frost. Perhaps it is nothing more than wind trapped in caverns. Or perhaps it is the mountain, still humming the teacher's final breath. And so the story ends where sound becomes silence again, the echo fading into sleep. For some truths are not meant to be taught, only heard once and then carried inward like a secret flame, waiting for the moment when the soul is quiet enough to listen. At first light, the world becomes a vessel of glass. The lake lies unbroken before him, pale and still, a mirror sky poured upon the earth. Clouds drift across its surface like slow caravans. Mountains kneel at its edge, and even the wind hesitates as if afraid to shatter so perfect a silence. He kneels at the shore where frost turns the reeds to silver threads, and he listens, not to the birds or the distant bell of herdsmen, but to the hush beneath the hush, the breath beneath the breath. They say the teacher sought a river that did not show itself, a current that moved in secret below these star-marked waters. Old fishermen told of springs that sang at night, of cold tongues rising from unseen caves to sweeten the lake and then retreat into darkness. Scholars later spoke of karst and cavern and hidden channels under the hills, but the stories of the valley were simpler, that there is a river of remembering and a river of forgetting, and both pass beneath this mirror without disturbing its face. He unrolls a strip of linen and places it on the shore like a small altar. Upon it he sets three things: a clay lamp, a reed stylus, and a pebble marked with a spiral. He does not write. He watches the sky write itself instead. The sun lifting, a thin veil of cloud turning gold, a hawk's shadow passing like a dark syllable across the page of water. What needs ink when the world is already speaking? The river does not announce itself, yet the lake breathes, almost imperceptibly, a slow rise and fall as though answering a question not yet asked. The teacher closes his eyes and remembers other waters, the library fountain at Antioch, where light once scattered like coins over stone basins, the rain barrels of monasteries that caught thunder and turned it to drinking water, the desert wells rimmed with rope burn and prayer. He remembers a line he carved into plaster long ago: all true teachings return to silence the way rivers return to the sea. He wonders where the sea is in a valley so far from any shore. A shepherd boy approaches and stands at a respectful distance, clutching a bundle of kindling. His people live in reed huts near the marsh. They guide their flocks by the stars and by old songs no map can hold. The boy points to a place across the water where the surface seems darker. Here it rises, he whispers. Here it sinks. He has no scrolls, no diagrams. He has inherited the listening of generations. Then he is gone, footsteps soft as moths on the frost-stiff grass. As the morning widens, the teacher walks the perimeter, counting not with numbers but with breaths. He pauses at inlets where the reeds whisper, at limestone shelves veined with mineral ribbons, at small caves that taste of ancient salt. There are marks chiseled into a low cliff, not letters, but constellations, tiny cups carved in patterns that mirror winter stars. Someone long before had charted the heavens to understand the behavior of water. It fits with what the old astronomer priests once knew, that sky and spring answer each other, that the same hidden geometry guides both the drift of constellations and the pull of underground streams. At noon, the lake becomes a polished shield. The mountains around it look closer than they are, gathered like elders in a circle. He seats himself on a rock and lets the silence move through him. Thoughts rise like small fish and vanish. A heron steps through shallows, blue and slow, a priest in feathered robes. He dips his hand into the water and it is colder than he expects, a shock that steadies the mind. When he lifts his palm, droplets cling and glitter, a rosary of sunlight that slides away one bead at a time. There are stories of pilgrims who threw a question into this water the way one might cast a stone, and the lake, refusing urgency, returned the answer years later at a different shore. So he does not ask quickly. He lets the question ripen in him. What is the shape of a truth that never appears on the surface? He looks down and sees his reflection holding still, but beneath it something darker moves. Not a fish, not a shadow, a motion without form. He understands then why the elders call it the river that remembers. It keeps the impressions of all that touches it long after contact. It keeps even the touch of absence. Toward evening the sky becomes a bowl of ash and rose. He lights his clay lamp and sets it at the water's edge. Its small flame doubles in the mirror, two sisters facing each other. A thin wind travels across the basin, and the reflection trembles, opens, closes, as though the surface were a veil drawn and released by a careful hand. He speaks into that trembling, not to command, but to join. He names those he has lost, those he never met, those who will come after. Names dissolve into tone. Tone thins into breath. Breath fades into the quiet traction of the hidden current. Night arrives with a ritual softness. Stars appear first in the lake and then in the sky, as if the earth remembered them before heaven did. He thinks of the old belief that souls cross water to reach their resting place, and he wonders if rest is not a destination but a depth, a surrender into what moves beneath the scene. He draws the spiral on damp sand, widening it until its outer ring touches the lamp's light. Then he erases it with his sleeve, and in the faint trace that remains he hears a lesson older than words. Not all shapes are meant to be kept. When he finally rises, the lamp flame leans toward the dark as if listening. He lifts the pebble, the stylus, the linen, and leaves no mark behind. Across the water a narrow ribbon shifts from black to silver, the hidden river exhaling, drawing in, keeping its vow of secrecy. He does not try to follow it underground. He has learned what he came to learn. Perhaps it was never meant to be found, only felt. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And some waters teach by refusing to ripple, by holding the sky so perfectly that we remember what the sky is for. A gate, a silence, a mirror opening inward toward the sea we carry within. He followed the river until the air turned sweet with smoke and juniper. There, in a fold of hills the color of bone, stood a village so quiet it seemed unfinished. A handful of houses shaped from clay and breath, roofs stitched with straw, doors made from the same trees that circled their courtyards. No sign marked it, no road claimed it. Simply was like the pause between two thoughts. They say the people here spoke without words. Their language lived in gesture. Palms turning like petals, heads bowed to show agreement, eyes lowered to signal sorrow. A smile could mean many things. Remembrance, forgiveness, farewell. The teacher arrived near dusk, when the air smelled of rain and smoke, and the villagers welcomed him with silence so deep it felt like a song sung inwardly. He was given a mat near the hearth of the elder woman. She had skin the color of the earth after rain and eyes that held the calm of long listening. When she offered him water, she touched her chest with 2 fingers, a motion he later learned meant peace between us. Around her, children traced shapes in ash. Circles, waves, spirals. The same forms appeared on their pottery and door lintels. They called them the breaths of time. Though no word for time existed here, only the rhythm of tasks and the turning of light. For 7 days he stayed among them, watching how they lived without calendars, without names, without the endless echo of self. Each morning began with smoke rising from clay ovens. Each evening ended with hands pressed together in gratitude to the fading sky. No one spoke of gods, yet reverence filled even the act of mending a bowl. He wondered how a people could vanish so completely from maps and yet feel so present in being. Later travelers would describe similar settlements scattered through the highlands of Mesopotamia, communities of seekers who fled the noise of empire, living only by rhythm and silence. Some link them to the early Nazorians, others to desert mystics who believed speech divided what was once whole. One night the teacher sat beneath the olive trees at the village edge. Lanterns flickered through the mist, and 1,000 insects wove their thin metallic hymns. He thought of the scrolls he had burned, of the questions he still carried like stones. Here, there were no answers, only gestures. A hand resting briefly on his shoulder, a smile disappearing into shadow. Perhaps, he thought, wisdom is not the gathering of words but their release. When he asked through signs what this place was called, the elder woman simply drew a circle in the dust and blew upon it, scattering it into the night air. It was then he understood they had no name because naming was the first step toward losing what was sacred. To name is to divide. To remain unnamed is to belong. At dawn he joined them in their quiet ritual. Each person walking to the center of the square, touching the ground, and bowing toward the 4 directions. It was said to renew harmony between the heart and the horizon. He felt something loosen in him, the need to be remembered, the need to teach. He was not a figure apart from them but a movement in their stillness. On his final morning, mist clung to the rooftops like breath that refused to leave. The villagers gathered to see him off. None spoke, none waved. They simply watched until he vanished along the path, their eyes following him as though carrying a prayer that could not be voiced.